Okay, so you want to get smarter. Who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Boost that brain power. And you've sent over, wow, a ton of research on all kinds of techniques to do just that. Really impressive, I gotta say. We're talking brain training apps, meditation, even like electrical stimulation. You went all out.
Sounds like you're looking for like the ultimate brain upgrade. And
Yeah.
honestly, looking at a bunch of different approaches is the right idea. There isn't, a one size fits all, like a magic button, unfortunately.
Right. No magic button, bummer. But is actual science here, which is way more interesting. So where do we even start with all this?
Well, one study that was really interesting looked at using physical exercise along with cognitive training. And it seems like that pairing, doing both, could be really impactful for something called fluid intelligence.
Okay, fluid intelligence. I feel like I've heard that before, but remind me what that is again.
Basically, it's like your ability to think on your feet, to solve problems and be adaptable to new situations. Think critically in the moment without just relying on stuff you've already learned.
Gotcha. So it was about being adaptable, not just like a walking encyclopedia.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is this study, it was by Doherty and their team back in 2018. They found that combining fitness with the brain training led to some big improvements in something called visuospatial reasoning. So like imagine trying to mentally fold a piece of paper into some complicated shape.
Oh, like origami.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's that kind of spatial reasoning. And that's a key part of this whole fluid intelligence idea.
So it's not just about getting your heart rate up, but challenging your brain at the same time. Love it.
Exactly. And this actually connects to another thing you wanted to look into, working memory training. You can almost think of working memory like your brain's juggling act. It's how well you can hold on to and actually use multiple pieces of information all at once.
Okay, so more than just remembering where I put my keys, which honestly I could use some help with. But how do you actually like train your working memory?
So one of the most studied ways is using something called the NBAC test. Kind of like a memory game, but way harder. You're given, a sequence of things, could be numbers, letters, even locations, and you have to like signal when the current thing you're seeing matches the one that you saw N steps back.
So like for a two-back test, I'd have to remember what I saw 2 steps ago. That sounds tough.
It can be, but the research is pretty convincing. It seems that the more you do these kinds of exercises, the better you get at reasoning and problem solving. There's this dose-dependent relationship they've found, meaning just like exercise, the more effort you put in, the more you get out of it.
Makes sense. Speaking of putting in the work, you also send over some research on mindfulness and meditation. And I gotta admit, I always think of meditation as more for relaxing, not so much for boosting brain power.
Yeah, I mean, relaxing is a big part of it for sure. But mindfulness, it's not just about feeling zen. Turns out that all that attention training, being more present, like really in the moment, it can actually have a big effect on how well your brain like works.
Okay, so how does that work exactly? What's the connection between like mindfulness and making smarter decisions or something?
Well, imagine like your mind is a spotlight, right?
Yeah.
Mindfulness is kind of like it helps you control that spotlight better. So it's focused on what actually matters instead of just like flitting around everywhere and getting lost in distractions.
So instead of a spotlight, my mind is more like what, one of those disco balls spinning everywhere at once?
Exactly. Mindfulness helps you like tame that disco ball a bit. And it's not just about attention either. It also helps you get better at just like noticing your emotions. So you're less likely to make those impulsive decisions just based on, whatever you're feeling at that exact second.
So I'm less likely to send that strongly worded email when really I'm just like hangry. I see the appeal.
Exactly. And remember that study we were talking about earlier, the fitness and brain training one? Well, they actually found that mindfulness, when you add that into the mix, it's like a brain boost. Like it actually made the positive effects of the cognitive training even stronger.
Wow. So it's like a bonus level to leveling up your brain. You also mentioned, I think you called it transcendental meditation. Is that like different from the mindfulness meditation thing?
It is. It's its own specific type of meditation. And the research on it, on how it helps your brain, is actually really interesting. There was this one study, they found that it actually made people better at things like reaction times and even problem solving.
Wow. It's kind of wild to think about that just taking time to quiet your mind, it could really have such a big impact. Now, for a completely different approach, you also mentioned something about like electrifying methods for cognitive enhancement. Are we getting futuristic now?
Let's just say it's definitely the cutting edge, for sure. We're talking about things like transcranial direct current stimulation, or
Yeah.
like TDCS for short. And then there's also transcranial random noise stimulation, or TRNS.
Okay, my brain needs like simpler names for those for sure. But what do they even do? Like, really?
So basically, they both use these super mild electrical currents, and those get applied to specific parts of your brain.
So we're talking about like zapping the brain with electricity.
It sounds way more intense than it really is. It's not like, think of it more like it's like giving your neural connections a little nudge in the right direction, helping them to like talk to each other better.
Interesting. Okay, so is this something that actually works all on its own, or does it have to be like combined with some of the other methods we were talking about, like the cognitive training and stuff?
That's such a good question.
Mm.
And it's really important these techniques, they're not like a magic bullet on their own.
Mm.
Where they really shine is when you pair them up with other brain training. Like it can really boost the effects of things like working memory exercises.
So it's like giving your brain an extra edge while it's what, in learning mode or something. What about the different types though? Are they all kind of the same, or are some types of stimulation more effective than others?
That's where it gets really interesting. So some research, and this is wild, suggests that certain types of stimulation, like if they use alternating current, it might actually be less effective than other kinds. It really just shows you how crazy complex the brain really is.
It really does make you realize we're still just like scratching the surface of understanding all this stuff. With all this talk of electrical brain stimulation and everything, it's got me thinking we've been focused a lot on these like direct brain changing things. But what about like a more, I don't know, a more fundamental approach? Like what about actually changing how we think in the first place?
I love that you brought that up because it's the perfect segue into something called SMART training. It stands for Strengthening Mental Abilities Through Relational Training. And it's all about building up what they call relational skills, which is really fascinating.
Relational skills. Is this about like being better at networking? Because I'm already killer at that. Just ask anyone.
Uh-huh. No, not quite. Networking is great, don't get me wrong. But we're talking about, like, cognitive relationships here. It's more about how well you can connect different ideas in your head, see how things relate to each other, like being good at analogies and metaphors and all that.
Okay, so less schmoozing at a party, more like, I don't know, brain schmoozing. I need a better way to picture this.
Okay, how about this? So you could memorize a bunch of historical dates and facts, right? Or you could try to really understand how those events actually relate to each other, like the cause and effect, how one thing led to another, shaped history and all that. You're seeing the bigger picture, not just those little separate facts.
Oh, I see what you mean. So how does this SMART training, how does it actually work? Like, are there brain puzzles involved or what?
Kind of, yeah. A lot of times it uses exercises that make you stretch those relational thinking muscles. Like they might give you two ideas that seem totally unrelated, and you have to find as many connections between them as you can.
That actually sounds kind of fun. So does it actually, work for real?
The research is really promising.
Right.
One study back in 2018, they found that this type of training, SMART training, it actually led to people getting higher IQ scores.
Hmm.
And the biggest improvements they saw were in things like verbal reasoning and vocabulary.
So what you're saying is if I do my SMART training, I can finally dominate at Scrabble.
Uh-huh. Well, no promises on the Scrabble dominance. But it really does show how powerful those relational skills can be. It's not just about how much you know, it's about how well you can connect the dots and actually use the information.
It's like having a bunch of ingredients, that's one thing, but knowing how to combine them all into an awesome meal, that's a whole other skill.
Speaking of which, you sent over some research on how intelligence develops early on, like in childhood. I feel like that's such a critical time, but often gets overlooked.
It really is, and the research really backs that up. There are studies showing that even early interventions, like back when kids are in preschool, can have these lasting positive effects. Like they had these kids do computerized working memory training, and get this, those kids were still showing improvements even months later in things like problem solving and fluid intelligence. Wow, that's pretty amazing. It really shows how important all those early experiences are for sure. But are we like doomed if we didn't have intense brain boosting as toddlers?
Not at all. That's the great thing. Learning is a lifelong thing. There are studies that have actually shown that if you keep learning new things, especially things that make you think abstractly and problem solve, that can actually improve your intelligence, both fluid and crystallized at any age.
So it's never too late to start learning and get those brain cells fired up.
Oh.
I love it. Well, we've covered a ton of ground here, everything from hitting the gym to quiet meditation, even to, zapping your brain with electricity.
Right. And that's what makes this whole area so fascinating, you know? There's so much we're still discovering about how our brains work and how to unlock even more of their potential. Who knows what amazing breakthroughs are just around the corner.
Yeah, exactly. So keep those brains buzzing, everyone, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive into the latest discoveries.